Once upon a time, in sun-scorched landscapes of southern Africa, where the mighty Zambezi River cascades over Victoria Falls and thorny acacia trees, at the horizon, Ian Douglas Smith emerged as the embodiment of a colonial vision that would defy the world. Born on April 8, 1919, in Selokwe, southern Rhodesia, now Shirugwe, Zimbabwe, to Scottish immigrant parents, Smith grew up in a settler society shaped by British imperialism. His father, a miner and farmer, instilled in him a rugged self-reliance, while his experiences as a Royal Air Force pilot during World War II forged an unbreakable resolve. Shot down over Italy in 1944, Smith suffered severe facial injuries and burns, yet he returned to the skies, earning a reputation for tenacity. This wartime heroism would later define his political career, as he viewed himself not as a tyrant, but as a guardian of Western civilization on a continent unraveling from colonial rule. Smith's ascent to power culminated in one of the most audacious acts of the 20th century, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, on November 11, 1965. As Prime Minister of the self-governing British colony of Southern Rhodesia, Smith broadcast a message from Salisbury, now Harare, declaring independence to preserve what he called justice, civilization, and Christianity. This was no mere rhetoric. It was a direct challenge to Britain's push for majority rule, rooted in the 1923 constitution that had granted Rhodesia internal autonomy while reserving foreign affairs to London. At the time, Rhodesia's white minority, approximately 270,000 out of a total population exceeding 4 million, controlled the levers of power through a qualified franchise that favored property owners and the educated, effectively excluding most black Africans. Smith's Rhodesian Front Party, elected in 1962, campaigned on maintaining this system, fearing that rapid decolonization would mirror the chaos in neighboring states like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where independence in 1960 led to civil war, secession, and Mobutu Sese Seko's authoritarian regime. The Rhodesian fantasy, as it came to be known, was a vision of prosperity and stability under white minority rule. In the years following UDI, Rhodesia astonishingly flourished despite international isolation. The economy boomed, driven by tobacco exports, mining, and manufacturing. By 1970, GDP per capita rivaled that of many European nations. Sanctions imposed by the United Nations in 1966 were circumvented through ingenious smuggling networks, with oil flowing via South African ports and trade rerouted through sympathetic allies like Portugal's colonial Mozambique. Smith's government invested in infrastructure, dams like Kariba, roads, and schools, creating a facade of progress. Yet this success masked profound inequities. The 1930 Land Apportionment Act had divided the country, allocating 50% of the best arable land to whites, who comprised less than 5% of the population, while black Africans were confined to overcrowded tribal trust lands with poor soil. Political repression intensified. Black nationalist parties like the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, and Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, were banned, and leaders such as Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo were detained for over a decade. Smith's delusion lay in his conviction that this model could endure indefinitely in a region dominated by black majorities. Demographically, it was untenable. Black Africans outnumbered whites by ratios climbing toward 30-1 by the 1970s, with high birth rates and urbanization fueling discontent. Globally, the era of colonialism was ending. The United Nations Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples in 1960 condemned minority rule, and superpowers like the Soviet Union and China backed liberation movements. Smith's wartime mindset blinded him to these realities. He often remarked that one man, one vote would be national suicide, ignoring successful transitions in places like Kenya under Jomo Kenyatta. As guerrilla incursions began in earnest after 1966, with ZANU and ZAPU forces trained in Zambia and Tanzania, the Bush War erupted, claiming thousands of lives and exposing the fantasy's fragility. Villages were razed, civilians caught in crossfire, and the military draft drained young white men, many of whom emigrated, accelerating the demographic imbalance. It was heartbreaking to witness a society tearing itself apart, as Smith's intransigence radicalized opposition, turning manageable reform into inevitable conflict. The West's abandonment of Ian Smith unfolded as a series of calculated retreats, amplifying the heartbreak of a leader who had staked everything on shared cultural ties. Britain, Rhodesia's colonial parent, bore the brunt of Smith's accusations of treachery. From the 1950s, London had navigated the dissolution of the Central African Federation, 1953 to 1963, granting independence to Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, and Nyasaland, Malawi, under majority rule while stalling on Southern Rhodesia. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's 1960 Wind of Change speech in Cape Town signaled the end, but negotiations with Smith under Harold Wilson dragged into acrimony. Wilson insisted on no independence before majority African rule, NIBMR, while Smith demanded guarantees for white interests. UDI provoked outrage. Britain condemned it as rebellion but refrained from military action, citing the risk of civil war among kith and kin. Instead, selective sanctions were imposed in 1965, escalating to comprehensive UN measures in 1968, including an oil embargo. Yet these were porous. British firms like Shell and BP indirectly supplied fuel through subsidiaries, highlighting the hypocrisy that deepened Smith's sense of betrayal. The United States, viewing the Cold War through an ideological prism, initially offered tacit support. Under Richard Nixon, the 1971 Byrd Amendment allowed imports of Rhodesian chrome, vital for U.S. defense industries, bypassing UN sanctions and framing Rhodesia as an anti-communist ally akin to South Vietnam. Smith seized on this, positioning his regime as a bulwark against Soviet and Chinese influence in Africa. However, the tide turned with Henry Kissinger's realpolitik. Alarmed by the 1975 fall of Portuguese colonies, Angola to Cuban-backed communists and Mozambique to FRELIMO, Kissinger in 1976 pressured South African Prime Minister John Vorster to isolate Smith. In a pivotal Pretoria meeting on September 19, 1976, Smith was cornered. Accept majority rule within 2 years or face total abandonment. Vorster, facing his own sanctions over apartheid, withdrew crucial military and economic aid, including helicopter support for Rhodesian operations. Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, while averting broader Soviet gains, sacrificed Rhodesia, leaving Smith to lament in his memoirs, The Great Betrayal, that the West had sold us down the river. This desertion was heartbreaking in its human toll, as documented in historical records. The Bush War, intensifying after 1972 with attacks like the Altina farm raid, saw over 30,000 deaths by 1979, including civilians from all sides. Rhodesian forces, renowned for their efficacy, the Sealess Scouts' pseudo-operations turned guerrillas against each other, could not stem the tide as ZANU's Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, and ZAPU's Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA, swelled with recruits. Sanctions crippled the economy. Inflation soared, fuel shortages grounded aircraft, and white emigration reached 1,000 per month by 1978. Smith's 1978 internal settlement attempted compromise, installing Bishop Abel Muzorewa as Prime Minister of Zimbabwe Rhodesia in 1979, but it was rejected by nationalists and the international community for lacking credibility. Mugabe and Komu boycotted, and Britain refused recognition. Smith's madness amplified here. In a black-majority continent where independence movements had toppled empires from Algeria to Zambia, he clung to minority rule, underestimating the guerrillas' resilience and global support. By 1979, Black Africans constituted 96% of the population, their grievances over land and rights fueling a war that cost Rhodesia 40% of its GDP in military spending. The West's letdown, prioritizing détente and anti-apartheid optics, ignored Smith's warnings about communist incursions, yet his refusal to enact earlier reforms, like those proposed in the 1961 Constitution, ensured isolation. As South Africa distanced itself post 1976, Rhodesia's fantasy teetered, a poignant reminder of how ideological rigidity meets geopolitical expediency. The collapse arrived at London's Lancaster House Conference from September to December 1979, a diplomatic denouement that stripped away the last vestiges of Smith's dream. Under Margaret Thatcher, Britain convened talks with all parties, including Mugabe and Komu, sidelining Smith as a relic. The agreement mandated a ceasefire, British-supervised elections, and majority rule, with guarantees for white land rights that proved ephemeral. Smith, present but powerless, signed reluctantly, later decrying it as capitulation. On April 18, 1980, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, with Mugabe's ZANU-PF winning 57 of 80 common roll seats in a landslide monitored by international observers. Jubilation in Harare masked underlying tensions. White flight accelerated, with 100,000 emigrating by 1985, draining expertise from farms and industries. The West's final betrayal manifested in post-independence complacency. Britain pledged £75 million in aid but overlooked early authoritarianism. The US, under Jimmy Carter, lifted sanctions swiftly, ignoring Mugabe's Marxist rhetoric. When the Gukurahundi Campaign, 1983 to 1987, unleashed North Korean-trained forces on Matabeleland, killing an estimated 20,000 Debele civilians in a crackdown on ZAPU dissidents. Western response was muted, diplomatic protests but no sanctions, prioritizing Zimbabwe's non-aligned stance. Smith's prophecies seemed fulfilled as the economy faltered. Land reforms in the 2000s seized white farms without compensation, triggering hyperinflation, 89.7 sextillion% in 2008, and reducing a once prosperous nation to reliance on food aid. By 2025, Zimbabwe's GDP per capita lags far behind Rhodesia's peak, with corruption and sanctions over human rights abuses compounding the decline. Yet Smith's craziness remains evident in historical retrospect. His belief that Rhodesia could stand alone ignored inexorable demographics. Black population growth from 4 million in 1965 to 7 million by 1980 overwhelmed the white minority's hold. In a region where black-led governments dominated post-1960s, his model echoed doomed regimes like French Algeria. Unrepentant until his death on November 20, 2007 in Cape Town, after Mugabe stripped his citizenship in 2002, Smith's memoirs rail against betrayal, but records show his rejection of compromises, like the 1976 Geneva talks, prolonged the war. The heartbreak lies in the squandered potential. Gradual integration might have averted bloodshed, but Smith's colonial fantasy, clashing with African realities, ensured tragedy. The West's abandonment, driven by moral and strategic shifts, amplified the fall, leaving echoes of a lost era in Zimbabwe's struggles. An insightful tale of hubris and forsaken alliances.